Jesus said in the Bible that you shall know them by their fruits. And when we look at the fruits of your Negro pastor, it's clear that he is nothing more than a branch full of briars and thorns. When we look at your Afro American Negro community, with a church on virtually every corner of almost every block, you would think that the African American Negro community would be one of the most prosperous places in the world. Unfortunately, it's one of the places with the greatest poverty in the world, the most crime in the world, the highest unemployment rate, and it's literally a den of sin and iniquity. You would think, with all these pastors teaching the Word of God and preaching the Word of God, God would be able to pour out His blessings and facilitate to the needs of the African American Negro. But when we look at the Afro American Negro's relationship with God, it's clear there's something wrong because if we have all these churches, the black community should be, spiritually strong. It should be a place where there was love and caring and sharing and people having a close relationship with God. But when we look at the black community, we put it under a microscope, we see that it's not bearing any fruit. In fact, all it's bearing is briars and thorns because how can a community with a church on every corner be the number one community that leads the nation in abortions? How can a community with a church on every corner have the highest out of wedlock birth rate? How can a community that has a church on every corner have a high crime rate? How can a community, with a church on every corner have high unemployment? When you look at the black community and you look at the fruit that is being bared by your Afro American pastors, it's clear they are not sowing the seeds, the way a sower should. I mean, we should be reaping a bountiful harvest in the African American community with all these churches in the community. I mean, these children that we raise should be, you know, morally and spiritually right and, functioning adults because if they are being raised in the church and the church is supposed to be teaching the Word of God, you would think people would be following, God's natural order and that the black community would be following God's natural order where God is the head, Jesus who is reigning over the earth, and there's man who's the head of the family, the woman who is the helpmeet and support and the teacher of the culture of the Word of God, and the children would be under that. But when we look at the African American Negro community, that we don't see that at all. We don't see that paradigm, that model being followed. Instead, we see a model that is completely dysfunctional. And this is with all these churches in place, with these, moral and spiritual centers, which are supposed to be God centered. We look at those moral and spiritual centers, and it's clear that there's something wrong with all these churches. Why are people so immoral, and why is everything so morally and spiritually bankrupt? Why are African American children as young as, what is it, about 11, 12 years old, going to get abortions? Why are children, getting involved with fornication, premarital sex, at ages as young as 8 or 9 years old? Why is your African American community have the highest out of wedlock birth rate? Why are so many black women single mothers? And why are so many black men, out of work? There is something out of whack with the Afro American Negro community's relationship with God, and that has to do, I believe, with the way these pastors have been preaching the Word of God and, basically their whole moral center. If you're preaching the Word of God, you were supposed to be an example of Christ. I look at your black church, you know, and it is no longer the spiritual and moral center of your Afro American Negro community. Sadly, it actually promotes most of the immorality and depravity in your black community as we speak right now because this is the fruit that your Afro American Negro community is bearing. If you look outside and see all the debauchery and perversion that is out here, this is the fruit that came from the seeds planted. It's clear that the seeds that are planted were thorns and briars in your black community? Because when I look at it and I see, because I walk down the street every day to go to the library or just to go do errands, and I see three, four churches, on that short path, you know, down one avenue and then up a higher avenue, I see four or five more churches. And I would think with all of these churches, you know, in the Negro community and in, poor areas like the South Bronx, again, God would be pouring out abundant blessings on black people and poor people overall, and they would be prospering because they would be following his word and being examples of Christ. But I don't see that because your Negro pastor is not a clear example of Christ. He's not following, and trying to be Christ-like. Many pastors, from what I'm seeing, from the fruit that they're bearing, are reaping this bitter harvest of briars and thorns. And when I look at that bitter harvest, I mean, you have males who are acting like females and females who act like males, and that is a byproduct of these homes, and it's clear to me that the culture, the pastor enables the bad culture instead of speaking out against it, because you don't I notice again, you never, like I said in the previous video, you'll never hear a pastor, preach a sermon telling the woman about a role. And the reason why he won't do that is because he does not want to threaten his economic base, because he knows his economic base, for the most part, is this Negro woman, and he gets 10% of her income off the top if he preaches a sermon that she agrees with and follows a narrative that she agrees with, because he doesn't want to lose his money. And that's why he won't preach that sermon. And he won't preach, a sermon talking about, bearing good fruit and, being the seed. Because in order to have good fruit, you have to have good seeds. And he won't put those seeds in the ground because, again, it goes against what he wants to do economically. He wants to continue making 10% off the top. So he'll go along and condone all of the dysfunction, all of the chaos, all of the immoral and depraved behavior. He will not, go and, preach from this. No, he's not going to preach from that. No. What he's going to do is mix up biblical scriptures with feminist ideologies and, pop culture, and call that ministering to people, when what he needs to do is minister from the Word of God. And when we look at your Negro pastor, he's going to be punished more so than anybody else. And the reason why he would be punished more so, because he knows the Word of God, and he makes no efforts to try to preach to anyone. Instead, he panders to a false God, which is this imaginary white man, aka the white liberal, and he supports the ideology of this imaginary white man, aka the white liberal, and he would rather preach that doctrine than follow God's doctrine. And he would rather steer the Afro-American Negro community down a ditch so he can get 10% off the top. And that's what makes him, one of the slimiest people you'll ever know and associate with. Because for him to be that dishonest, spiritually bankrupt and morally bankrupt, that he'll throw black people, and the moral compass of the community down a sewer, it shows you, a complete malice of forethought and depraved indifference. And that's what this pastor has for the black community. He has malice of forethought and depraved indifference. He does not care about anyone, and he does not care about the needs of anyone. And he is not an example of Christ, because Christ would not, throw people under the bus like that. I mean, he came down to earth to sacrifice his life so that so he could pay for the sin debt of all humanity. But your pastor, does not follow that model at all. Instead, he's only out for himself. He's only out to get ahead. And he's only thinking about, this life and not the next one. And that's what's really, sad about it, because that's why your church today is not the house of God, but a den of thieves. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.